In the midst of the emotional turmoil quietly sweeping through the Brown family, there was still another dimension of neglect, one that mostly flew below the public's radar: how the family handled both finances and health care. This became particularly glaring with the case of Isabel's scoliosis surgery, one that obviously could have been managed a whole lot better had Kody Brown made more advisable decisions from the start. I am Anya, and welcome back to Reality Recap. Scoliosis is a progressive condition, and Isabel had been suffering through severe chronic pain on a daily basis for months. But despite the entire waiting period of her deteriorating condition, it took an incredible 9 months before Christine was finally able to get the insurance she needed for her surgery. That's 9 months of unwarranted pain for a teenager who should have had immediate access to treatment. So what held things back? Kody's response was nothing short of confusing. Rather than taking firm action to guarantee Isabel's welfare was paramount, he dawdled, placing the cost squarely on Christine's shoulders. And it wasn't like they didn't have the resources to act sooner. The Browns were already well off financially, living comfortably in big houses, owning several vehicles, and taking vacations as they liked. They flat out had the means to take care of their children's medical bills in a timely manner. But Kody didn't do it. He didn't want to dip into family funds for the surgery, even though they could have easily paid for it, waiting instead until Isabel was 18 and could get insurance for herself, despite the fact that her condition was only getting worse. This wasn't merely a money issue, it uncovered a much deeper problem within the family: a pattern of avoidance. Instead of dealing with issues head-on, Kody tended to let them linger, thereby leaving others, specifically Christine, to clean up the mess. In this instance, their financial stability did not equate to good planning or sane decision-making, where their children's health was at issue. Although they had all the outward signs of success, they did not manage to obtain even as basic as decent health coverage. Kody's behavior in this instance revealed a stark inconsistency in his parenting. He insisted on emotional commitment and domination in almost every part of family life, but when it came to real material needs, such as his children's health, he preferred to withdraw, leaving his children to endure the consequences of his inaction. Along the way, the emotional hypocrisy and parental abandonment within the Brown family have caused enormous damage. The harm done by Kody's choices, or his inability to make them, can't be ignored. For some families, the pandemic was a period of solitude, but for the Browns, it was a mirror that showed them the fractures that had been developing long before beneath the surface. Kody's lack of willingness to value emotional intimacy or wellness within his family didn't simply hurt his relationships with his children, it broke them, professionally. The emotional scars left are evident not only in the continuing difficulties each family member has to endure, but in the increasing feeling of abandonment that several of them have loudly vocalized. Kody's remoteness, particularly in the way he reacted when Garrison was having emotional issues during the pandemic, is a prime example. Garrison had a difficult time, but he was on his own, without the benefit of the one person who should have been helping him navigate it. That same pattern repeated itself with Isabel, weeks of suffering before receiving the attention she deserved. In the meantime, Janelle, Christine, and Mary were the emotional support system of the family, despite Kody checking out emotionally. These women took up the emotional labor Kody left behind, calming their children, providing support, and establishing a sense of stability when everything else in their lives seemed to be spiraling out of control. But it didn't happen without consequence. It heavily impacted their own mental and emotional health. Just think about how things could have been different if Kody had decided to show up. If he had been there, not merely physically but emotionally as well, fully conscious of his children's psychological states and concerned with the emotional welfare of his wives. If only he had been the father his family required, when he was most needed. The Browns could have had a prayer of writing out their difficulties in one piece, but without emotional intimacy and with Kody's increasing distance, the gaps between them widened to an extent that continues to shape their lives in irrevocable terms. What it all comes down to is the grave truth. When a father and a wife are not in a position to offer reliable emotional support, even the most tightly tied families can disintegrate. And with the passing of time without that support, the damage becomes even harder to mend. His other wives' emotional needs went unmet, resulting in obvious scars. One obvious illustration was the gift he presented to Robyn, a personal touch so much more than he had ever given Mary, Christine, or Janelle. The comparison was stark, a harsh reminder of how emotionally distant he'd become from the remainder of the family. Worse, Mary, already quietly fighting years of emotional abuse and self-doubt, was forced into a position that was more performance than partnership. Manipulated and feeling like a pawn, she was coerced into being publicly supportive of Kody's newfound relationship with Robyn. This wasn't about giving space to a new wife. It felt like emotional coercion. Mary was cornered emotionally, being asked to promote something that was shredding her from the inside out. Kody needed Mary to assist in making legitimate his relationship with Robyn, but betrayal is what Mary experienced instead. Instead of being given partner-like status, she was used as a prop within his narrative, a device employed to introduce a new romantic story, even if it shattered her heart. For Christine, the breaking point arrived on Valentine's Day. Already emotionally demoted by Kody, that day sealed her worst fears. The man she had given her life to, constructed a household and raised children with, had obviously moved on. He had checked out emotionally, and Christine was left to fend for themselves. What hurt the most wasn't his lack of attention. It was his complete disregard for her emotions. His emotional investment in Robyn, coupled with his condescending attitude towards Christine, left her alone and hurting with bitterness. She had invested everything in their relationship, only to be made invisible to him. That Valentine's Day was more than a day on the calendar. It was the day the emotional divide between Kody and his wives grew too wide to ignore. The quiet bitterness that had been simmering was now a gaping wound. Instead of owning up to it, Kody, as he so frequently did, began spinning a new tale. He created a story to explain his actions, telling himself and others that he was merely being true to his heart. In doing this, he avoided taking responsibility, feigning everything was fine when it most definitely was not. His attempt to rationalize the favoritism only intensified the emotional deficit, leaving the other wives feeling more invisible. Kody talked himself into believing that his marriages to Mary, Janelle, and Christine were still recoverable. But in the end, his behavior was just further estranging him from the very women whom he once had trusted most. And then, reality began to reveal itself. Private letters, previously secreted diary pages, and forgotten conversations surfaced. These pieces testified to a damning chronicle, not only of infidelity, but of a man who had deceived his wives and even himself. The magnitude of his emotional abandonment and subtle adultery was finally revealed. For the family, the discoveries were painful. The emotional abandonment that they had all felt from the beginning was no illusion. It was actual. And now there was evidence. The lies Kody had hidden were finally being revealed, and along with them, the trust that had kept the family united was being destroyed quickly. As this reality became clear, tensions came to a boiling point. The emotional space that had widened gradually over the years was now completely unignorable. Janelle, who had been the quiet backbone of the family, finally began to speak up, exasperated, disillusioned, and fed up with being pushed aside. Christine, no longer hiding her pain behind good manners, was deliberately venomous. And Mary, still reeling from the psychological abuse she had suffered, still grappled with the wound of having been discarded. The anger that Mary had been holding on to for so many years could no longer be concealed. Her annoyance was etched across her face. But it wasn't only the wives sensing the brunt of Kody's aloofness. The kids, having observed in silence the gradual disintegration of their family, started expressing their own pain. Kody's interactions with his children had become remote and chilly. The man who had once vowed to be a present and loving father was now disappointing them in ways that no one could ignore. The betrayal feelings had spread far beyond the wives, had begun to permeate all areas of the family, and the wounds that were left behind were deep. As the family gathered to celebrate what was to be a reunion, the emotional tension was palpable. Years of hurt, silence, and unresolved altercation hung thick in the atmosphere. What was originally intended to be an effort at familial harmony had evolved into a powder keg of long-buried secrets. And as the cameras filmed, it all burst into the open. There, in public for all to witness, Kody's affair with Robyn was no longer something to be spoken of behind backs. It was exposed in the open for all to behold. Emotional consequences were immediate. What might have been an introspective moment soon degenerated into an argument roiled by years of hurt, betrayal, and emotional distance. Kody attempted to hold the reins, tried to spin things like he always did, but it was too late. The harm had already settled in, and the wives, finally allowed to have their say, didn't pull any punches. Mary, who had long been referred to as the first wife, spoke up first. Her throaty voice, heavy with emotion, accused Kody of emotionally manipulating her, making her pretend that it was okay for him to become closer to Robyn, even though it hurt her immensely. That relationship, long concealed by deceitful half-truths, had been preserved at the expense of Mary. Janelle was not far behind, no longer attempting to conceal how invisible and starved of emotion she had been for so long. Robyn's favoritism had not only hurt their relationship, it had driven a wedge that made Janelle feel discarded. And then there was Christine, her betrayal no longer a secret she kept. She had already checked out of the relationship emotionally, but now the whole world was aware. She was finished. She wasn't fighting for something that didn't work anymore. And it was not only the wives, the children, those who had formerly held on to the vision of a loving, intact family, had their suffering as well. They too were victims of Kody's emotional withdrawal. It now hurtfully became apparent that the emotional manipulation and neglect didn't end with his wives. They went on to include his children as well. Their words were tears. They cried out about the emotional neglect they had experienced, being placed in the background as their father gave all his attention to Robyn. Their needs, their hurts, their wish to be acknowledged and loved had all been set aside. The fantasy of a healthy, functioning, plural family had by this time totally dissolved. Publicly, this was the last straw for so many viewers. The vision of Kody as caring, devoted patriarch immediately unraveled. Fans who had fought to defend him now realized the truth. An emotionally unavailable, manipulative man deeply engaged in self-interest. The carefully constructed image of a loving husband and father collapsed in real time. Kody's constant efforts to spin what had occurred, to gloss it all as some terrible misunderstanding, only served to heighten the backlash. His failure to read the room, to own up, or to demonstrate empathy made him more unpopular with the public. With the show still in production, it was clear the man who had asserted dominance over this polygamous clan now was an empty shell, emotionally detached, emotionally irresponsible, and now emotionally isolated. Considering the whole saga as a whole, it's impossible not to be overwhelmed by the weight of what all of this has cost everyone. The emotional damage done to Mary, Christine, and Janelle is heartbreaking. These women bear scars that will never truly heal. Mary, who had once been Kody's first love, had been treated like a mere pawn in his game to acquire Robyn. Manipulated into believing in something that dismantled her own marriage, she was left alone emotionally. Christine, who had once been full of life and optimism, eventually gathered the strength to exit a relationship that had long lost the characteristics of a partnership. And Janelle, years of effort to be the consistent, steady presence in the background, only to be silently nudged out of the way as Kody showered his attention upon someone else. These women didn't get abandoned. They were systematically erased in the mind of the man who ought to have loved them all equally. And the kids, the ones who'd grown up thinking their family was supposed to be a refuge, were left with ringside seats to the breakdown. They sat, powerless, and watched as their father emotionally abandoned them for another woman. They witnessed the fights, the tension, the increasing silence, and that is its own tragedy. The harm caused to these children who merely desired affection and attention from their father cannot be overstated. They were made to feel ignored, insignificant, and invisible. The very last thing that any child should ever have to feel, in her or his own home. Ultimately, the actual betrayal wasn't merely the affair. It was Kody's sheer inability to be emotionally truthful with the people that loved him most. That betrayal demolished the delicate trust keeping the Browns together. As a husband, as a father, and as a patriarch, Kody's failure left indelible cracks in an otherwise tightly woven family. When he could no longer provide them with honesty, respect, or presence, everything else that held them together began to fall apart. So, what's your take? Do you think Kody ever truly understood the full impact of his actions? Or was all of this just a game to him? Can trust ever be restored after something this profound? Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me hear from you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the drama surrounding Sister Wives, live.